Good morning. So this is joint work with a former student and a friend of mine, Jing lead student, Mike Lovenheim, a colleague. We're examining quantile treatment effects of college quality on earnings, evidence from administrative data in Texas, and one of those long titles that hopefully I will provide a very succinct summary of what that actually means. All right? So I'm using administrative data provided by the University of Texas at Dallas Education Research Center. So before I am allowed to give the results of my findings, I have to absolve the various institutions in the state of Texas of any blame or any credit with regards to the findings, right? So normally I read it, but it's up there. It's pretty big. You can see it. All right, so here's the outline, brief intro and motivation. I'll talk about the data and the methodology as such, go over the results. And the benefit of this particular presentation is that the results are pictures, right? We like pictures. For the most part, they're easily understood. And then I'll conclude. Right? So there's a large and growing literature, right, that examines the returns to college quality, right? So one of the more popular issues of the U.S. News and World Report is sort of college rankings, and having been in Texas, I know that parents and families expend resources to ensure that their children get into selective institutions. And so the question is, well, what do you get for that, right? What is the benefit, or what is one possible benefit of attending and perhaps graduating from a more selective institution, right? And so I don't want this presentation to just basically hang on what is college quality. Like, college quality is something, right, a way of differentiating one school from another. So I'm going to introduce a certain taxonomy. So at least in the economics literature, various definitions have emerged. You know, we want to know, do you get any additional returns after attempting to control for individual differences from having attended or graduated from a relatively elite college or university? And the findings are a bit are all over the place, right? So they're not all necessarily comparable because we're looking at different data sets. We're looking at different definitions of what is an elite institution, and we're also looking at different methodologies of identifying the returns, right? So, you know, this is by no means an exhaustive list of papers that examine this issue, but it's certainly representative, right? And so if we think that we want students to be informed with regards to the potential benefits from attending college, then this is just a subset of the information that they could potentially look at. And when you have you know, differences in findings of this magnitude, then you wonder, well, how much information is there really in terms of informing student decisions, right? And even then, some of the findings are relatively subtle, right? So some say there are big differences, but once I sort of condition and compare students, say, with similar application sets, then there are no differences. It's not necessarily clear that information is readily accessible for, you know, an ordinary student who endeavors to figure out where they want to go to college, where are they going to get the largest return for their investment, right? So some of the more popular ones we see very large returns. For example, Mark Hoekstra, and the most poorly kept secret of all, finds a 24% increase in earnings from attending the state flagship in the state of some state, right, to keep the secret going. However, there are other results that say that once you condition and you find an appropriate set of comparable individuals with comparable schools, then you don't see a big return, right? So given that, what does this literature miss? Well, one is just sort of basic statistics. I mean, we're basically, at some point, we're estimating conditional means. And we're just saying, after we condition on things, you know, here are the average returns conditional on what we know about students. But the mean is only one feature of any distribution, and there are certainly other aspects that are likely to be informative as you think about the decision that you want to make. The second point is that a lot of the studies, basically due to data availability, only focus on a very narrow subset of schools. And these schools tend to educate a relatively small percentage of individuals who go on to some sort of post-secondary education, right? So what is the utility of having a very well-identified answer that is not applicable to the majority of students who ultimately go on to some sort of post-secondary education, right? So, these are the lacuna that we hope to address in part with the research that we've done. All right, so, what do we do? We estimate sort of the returns, the impact of having graduated from a particular type of college on the distribution of earnings. All right, that is, rather than focusing on, say, the mean, we examine what it means to graduate from a particular institution after having basically adjusted for all the information that we have available in our data set prior to students entering a particular college type, right? In order to operationalize this, we have to provide a taxonomy for college types, right? So what we do is we basically envision four sectors, right? There are the two flagships, UT Austin and Texas A&M College Station, and then there's the non-flagship public four-year sector, for example, UTD, where I'm employed, UT Pan American, UT San Antonio, Texas Tech, Texas A&M Commerce, as well as many other, UT Arlington, for example. And then the final sector is the set of community colleges, Collin County Community College, Austin Community College, Dallas County Community College, right? And so these are sort of the sectors that we're going to investigate, right? And that taxonomy turns out to be pretty important and worthy of discussion, right? So what do we mean by college quality? That's a pretty good question. I don't know if that the literature is adequately defined what that is. So for our purposes, we just want to be able to say, however you want to look at this particular system of ordering colleges, that they're different, right? They're different with regards to the set of students that attend. They're different with regards to the resources that they can allocate per student, and they're also different with regards to some of the outcomes, right? Now, again, I'm not saying better or worse. I'm just saying that they're different, all right? And so what do we find? Well, we find that sort of standard mean estimates do a relatively poor job of characterizing the returns to college quality for most students, right? That is, the mean is informative, but there's additional information that you miss by not considering other aspects of the distribution of earnings. And we also find that there are large differences in the distributions across school types and with regards to race and ethnicity. All right, so we make use of administrative data housed at the UTD ERC, and that data comes from the following sources: the TEA, the THCCB, and the Texas Workforce Commission. And the outcomes are basically residuals of log quarterly earnings regressions after having conditioned on cohort, year, and quarter of year dummies, right? Essentially, we want a relatively stable, as best we can, that's analogous to sort of like a regular measure of earnings after having accounted for, the impact of graduating at a particular time, being in a certain set of economic conditions, all right? And so our sample is, we focus on male graduates from Texas's public colleges and universities who graduated from high school during the years 1996 to 2002. Ultimately, the sample includes now 94,000, a little bit more than 94,000 male graduates, and here are our sample inclusion criteria. Okay. So what do we estimate, right? So we estimate the distribution of returns from graduating from either UT Austin, Texas A&M College Station, or one of Texas's public community colleges relative to one of Texas's non-flagship public universities, right? So the idea is that if we think of a counterfactual, then we're basically going to use all the other public four-year universities in Texas to serve as counterfactuals, potential counterfactuals for the other three sectors that we've identified. Right? And so what's the problem? Well, what we want to know is, what is the return to, say, to graduating from UT Austin relative to graduating from UTD, right? And the problem is pretty fundamental. We don't observe an individual graduating from two institutions, right? That is, I can't tell you what would have happened had, Tommy graduated from UT Arlington as opposed to UTD, right? So what I need to do is I need to provide a reasonable estimate of what would have happened to Tommy had Tommy graduated from UT Arlington as opposed to UTD, right? Right, and so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to use the other non-flagship four-year public universities to serve as a source of potential counterfactuals. The idea being that there are students in these non-flagship public four-year universities that are comparable to students who finish at the flagships, and there are students in the non-flagship four-year publics who are comparable to students who ultimately decide to terminate their post-secondary education at the community colleges, right? So, but there's an issue, right? And the issue is, I imagine that there are basically two factors that contribute to what I ultimately observe about a student, right? There's influence, the treatment of graduating from a particular place, and there's also the characteristics that a student themselves bring to bear on the labor market, right? And so what I want to do is I want to account for the latter and attribute any differences that I observe to graduating from one institution as opposed to the other, right? So I imagine that there are students of all types in the non-flagship four-year publics, but they're represented in different proportions, right? So there are students at UTD who look like students at UT Austin. There's just not as many, right? And so what I want to do, the basic methodology then, is to appropriately reweight such that if I want to compare UT Austin to UT Dallas, then I'm going to place more emphasis on those students who look like they would have graduated from UT Austin. And I do this by using a propensity score reweighting method, right? That is, we estimate the likelihood of a student graduating from a particular type of college as a function of the observables, right? And we use that to reweight the entire distribution of earnings, right? The idea being that what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the non-flagship four-year public sector, I'm going to apply a set of weights such that on average the set of observable characteristics are equivalent to what you would see at UT Austin, and then I'm going to take those differences in the distribution of earnings for UT Austin and the reweighted distribution of earnings for the non-flagship public four-year sector, look at those differences and attribute that and call that the impact of graduating from a particular sector, right? But in order for that to work, you need for there to exist comparable students at both institutions, right? And so, what this basic sort of overlap graph indicates is there are students of all types at both institutions, but as expected, they appear in different proportions, right? So the idea is that I want to focus more on students who look like they should have graduated from UT Austin rather, but they're not as many. They're not in the same proportion in the non-flagship four-year public sector. So I'm going to reweight to place more emphasis on those students who are similar with regards to their observable characteristics to students who graduate from UT Austin. And so what I need is for there to be overlap, for there to be students who look like they could have graduated from the sector under consideration, right? And so what you want to look for, in these pictures is that these types do exist, right? That same logic applies to Texas A&M College Station, and it also applies to the community college sector, right? So where I'm basically saying, look, there are individuals of all types where type is now defined by the likelihood of graduating from a particular college sector, right? So, here are the findings, right? And so what you have here is basically a plot of the regression-adjusted quarterly earnings for UT Austin. And this is a plot of the adjusted quarterly earnings for the non-flagship four-year publics. And the red line is this represent these earnings after having adjusted the characteristics such that on average the distribution of observable characteristics between UT Austin and the non-flagship four-year publics are equivalent, right? So this red line represents the counterfactual, right? What would have happened, right, at every point in the distribution of earnings if a student graduated from UT Dallas with the same set of characteristics, with a similar distribution of characteristics as students who graduated from UT Austin, right? And at any particular percentile, I want to call the effect basically the vertical difference between this line and the red line, right? So I hope none of you are colorblind, because if you are, then it's between this line and the second line, right? Right, so what you have here is basically this difference plotted out for every percentile of the distribution of earnings. And what we have here is basically a measure of the mean, just a basic regression where we regress the adjusted quarterly earnings on the observable information. And what I want to point out is that there are differences when one examines the entire distribution of earnings as opposed to just focusing on the mean. So the mean return to graduating from UT Austin as opposed to graduating from a non-flagship four-year public is 11.5%, which is in line with a lot of the estimates sort of published in the literature. But when you look at the entire distribution of returns, right, you can see returns as low as, say, 5% on the lower end and approaching more than 30% returns at the high end, right? So what we want to point out is, basically looking at the mean misses a lot, right? And if you're thinking about where should I go to college, then the mean might not provide, if you're interested at all in anything with regards to risk, then you want to have information about these distributions. All right?
Use the clicker.
All right.
You can use the laser button.
All right.
If you want to.
Yeah, but I don't want people to see me shake. All right?
So you can keep it to light.
Yeah. Similar graph. And the difference plotted. So this is Texas A&M. Again, the mean is about a little more than 20%. Thank you. But, there are differences, particularly at the lower end of the distribution of earnings, where the returns, are above 30%. But you want to be careful here because of a problem with relatively small numbers as you approach the tail. But again, at least for the most part, it seems that for a large portion of the distribution of earnings, at least with regards to Texas A&M, the mean isn't so bad. All right. Similar graph for the community colleges, right? Right. But now, at least at the top end, there is a point where we see positive returns, and then there are estimates in the literature where if you look at sort of the returns of taking credit hours, say at a community college, where you find a negative return, and our mean estimates are in that ballpark. But here we demonstrate that there's still significant heterogeneity with regards to looking at the entire distribution of returns, right, which is sort of the basic point of this paper. Right. Now, here are our robustness checks where basically we do a number of things. So our sample is relatively young, and we worry that looking at individuals very early in their work, in their tenure, the age earnings profile is sort of upward sloping, and we're looking at people in their 20s. If we look at our oldest cohort, we find estimates that are comparable overall. So basically, the takeaway point of this picture is that we do a number of things in this paper, and we basically obtain the same results. The most important, I think, of these in particular are what we call with regards to the background sample, where for some students, we have information on family education and income. When we only examine that subsample and we estimate our results using that information, and then we also estimate that information on that subsample, sans that information, we get similar results, which suggests that the covariance that we have for everybody does a fairly good job of accounting for those differences. Right. We do the same thing for Texas A&M, and we do the same thing for community colleges, but these robustness checks are not as tight as the others. Right, so our conclusion is that mean estimates do a poor job of characterizing the returns to college quality for most students, where college quality is just basically sector. There are large distributions with regards to returns that vary across school types, and what we didn't get into in this paper is why. Right, so this is very much a paper about what can we find from the data, but it doesn't provide, any hypotheses, and that's sort of where we want to go next, right? So this paper highlights the need to look beyond the mean, particularly when thinking about how students ultimately make their post-secondary educational decisions.